Naomi Evans sat in the waiting area of the courthouse, her fingers tapping gently on her phone screen as she reviewed case notes. Her outfit, sharp and professional, was a stark contrast to the busy chaos surrounding her. Today, however, she wasn't there to fight a monumental legal battle or challenge a law. Instead, she was facing a routine traffic violation that, under normal circumstances, would barely register on her radar. Yet there she was, inside a small, somewhat run-down courthouse in a town that felt worlds apart from the government offices and grand meetings where she typically operated. The room around her buzzed with the kind of everyday drama that was often forgotten once the courtroom doors close. People were called to the stand for petty disputes, fines, or minor offenses. It was almost as if the true work of justice, the kind that really changed lives, was reserved for the larger, more complex cases, the ones that didn't make it to this level. Naomi, however, was a woman with many layers. Beneath her calm demeanor and professional appearance, she was far more than what she seemed in that moment. When the judge's clerk finally called her name, Naomi stood up with poise and walked into the courtroom, her heels clicking against the worn floors. The room smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and the overhead lights flickered just enough to be noticed. Sitting at the bench was Judge Thomas Palmer, a middle-aged man with a reputation for being no-nonsense. He was known for keeping the courtroom efficient, rarely tolerating delays or exceptions, and always quick to hand down decisions, especially when it came to fines. Judge Palmer didn't recognize Naomi immediately. To him, she was simply another defendant in a long line of minor cases. He glanced down at his docket, flipping through the papers until he landed on her name. A simple citation for a traffic violation. Nothing more. The judge's eyes briefly flicked up to meet Naomi's, noting her calm, collected presence before turning his attention back to the paperwork. "Naomi Evans," he began, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "You've been cited for failing to yield at an intersection. How do you plead?" Naomi's voice was steady, her words precise. "Guilty, Your Honor. It was an oversight." Without missing a beat, Judge Palmer nodded. "I see. The fine for this offense is $200, payable within the next 30 days. The words hung in the air, a simple transaction that, on the surface, seemed unremarkable. But there was something about Naomi's quiet composure that struck the judge in that moment. Something about the way she didn't react. No anger, no defensiveness, no apology. It was as if she had expected this outcome, as if this was just another part of the larger game she played. As Naomi turned to leave, her movements deliberate and measured, Judge Palmer couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than her straightforward admission of guilt. What he didn't know was that Naomi's calmness was far from indifference. It was the calm of someone who had seen far more injustice than this court could ever comprehend. The courtroom door closed behind her, and Judge Palmer sat back in his chair, lingering on the thought that this simple case had somehow felt like something more. But it would take time before he understood just how right he was. Outside the courtroom, Naomi stepped into the bright, midday sun, adjusting her sunglasses as she walked briskly toward her car. The quiet of the small town was a stark contrast to the pulse of the city she was accustomed to. In her world, people didn't simply pass through courtrooms. They changed them. They shaped laws, redefined policies, and fought for causes that others might not even notice. But today, Naomi was just another person caught in the web of routine bureaucracy. For most of the people around her, Naomi's name would likely never ring a bell, but within certain circles, particularly those with an eye on social justice and legal reform, Naomi Evans was a force to be reckoned with. She was a lawyer, yes, but her work went far beyond the typical courtroom battles. Naomi was known for advising on national legal reforms, particularly those dealing with race, fairness, and police accountability. She had helped draft several significant pieces of legislation aimed at addressing systemic inequality in the justice system. Her influence wasn't the kind that made headlines or earned her the kind of media attention other high-profile figures received. Instead, she worked quietly, behind the scenes, using her expertise to shape the federal response to issues like racial profiling, police brutality, and the disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans. It was her advice that had been instrumental in the development of new guidelines for law enforcement agencies, as well as strategies to ensure that justice was not a privilege reserved for a few and a right for all. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Naomi was well aware of how often her contributions were overlooked. She had long learned the art of operating in spaces where people didn't expect her, whether it was in high-level government meetings, where her voice carried weight despite her unassuming presence, or in the corporate boardrooms where the changes she advocated for were slowly, but surely, being adopted. But today in this small courthouse, Naomi was a regular citizen, subjected to the same routine of fines and tickets that so many others faced. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years working to reform the very systems that so often targeted people like her. And yet, here she was, in the same position as countless others, paying a price for a simple oversight. As she slid into the driver's seat of her car, Naomi's phone buzzed with a new message. It was a reminder about a key meeting later that afternoon, a strategy session with a group of federal policymakers. Naomi took a deep breath, glancing at the courthouse in her rearview mirror before driving away. This was her world, her fight, and her responsibility. The court case, while minor, was just a blip on the radar, a reminder of how much work remained to be done. While most people would have moved on from the incident, Naomi knew it would be a long time before she could forget the quiet injustice of it all. Later that evening, Judge Thomas Palmer sat alone in his office, staring at a pile of paperwork that seemed never-ending. The court session earlier that day had been uneventful, the kind of day he'd experienced countless times. But there was something about Naomi Evans, the woman who had appeared before him for a simple traffic infraction, that lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just a defendant in his courtroom. Curiosity gnawed at him. Naomi's composure had been almost unnerving, her calm acceptance of the fine leaving him with an odd sense of unease. Most people would have tried to plead their case, to argue their way out of the ticket. But Naomi had simply accepted her fate without protest, as though she had already seen it all before. It was that quiet strength that made him wonder who she really was. He couldn't help but think that a woman who exuded such confidence and calm couldn't just be some random driver caught in a traffic violation. Her name sounded vaguely familiar, but in his line of work, thousands of names passed through his courtroom. It wasn't until later that night, after a quiet dinner, that he decided to look into it. Palmer opened his laptop and started a quick search for Naomi Evans. The results weren't what he expected. He found articles, interviews, and even references to her work in some of the highest levels of government. Naomi Evans wasn't just a lawyer. She was a leader in the fight for racial justice and legal reform. She had worked alongside policymakers to draft federal guidelines addressing the very issues that had been a part of his courtroom for years: issues of racial bias, inequality in law enforcement, and the struggle for fair treatment under the law. She had been a key advisor to commissions that reshaped national conversations around justice. The more Palmer read, the more his surprise turned to disbelief. He'd just find a woman whose name appeared in connection with some of the most significant justice reform initiatives in the country. Naomi was helping guide federal policy on law enforcement practices, advocating for changes that could potentially affect thousands of lives. How could he have missed the significance of her presence in his courtroom? As the realization dawned on him, Palmer felt a rush of embarrassment. Here he was, a judge who had prided himself on knowing the law and understanding the people who appeared before him, and yet he had failed to recognize someone so influential. He sat back in his chair, contemplating how he had treated her like any other defendant. Just another person who'd made a mistake, subjected to the same system that, in Naomi's case, she was actively working to change. The unease that had lingered after the courtroom began to settle into something deeper. Palmer couldn't help but question his own actions. Had he judged her too quickly? And more troubling still, how many others were there like her? People working for change, who had been swept up in the same system they were trying to reform. The next few days were filled with a restless quiet for Judge Palmer. His routine, which once seemed familiar and comforting, now felt disorienting. He found himself distracted during hearings, unable to shake the thought of Naomi Evans sitting before him in his courtroom. The more he reflected, the more questions bubbled to the surface. Why had he assumed so little about her? Why had he reacted so quickly to impose a fine without a second thought? She had been calm, yes, but that calmness had now come to symbolize something else, something much larger than a simple traffic ticket. Judge Palmer had always prided himself on his fairness. He considered himself impartial, someone who had seen enough cases to avoid letting personal biases affect his decisions. But in this case, he couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something deeper had guided his actions, something he hadn't fully understood until now. He thought back to the moment in court where Naomi had stood before him with poise and dignity. He'd noticed it, that quiet strength, but he had brushed it off as just another person who accepted the inevitability of the system. In the past, he might have admired that type of acceptance as a sign of maturity, but now he couldn't help but wonder. Did Naomi accept the system because she believed in it, or because she knew it all too well? Was her calm a sign of resignation, or a deep understanding of how broken things were? As he sat at his desk, Palmer began to piece together the puzzle. Naomi Evans wasn't just someone who had been caught in a moment of carelessness. She wasn't just a defendant. She was someone who, through years of tireless work, had chosen to fight back against the very system he represented. And yet, he had treated her the same way he would any other person who appeared before him for a minor infraction. It stung to realize that his decision had been made without a full understanding of her significance. His thoughts turned inward. Was this just an isolated incident, or was he blind to the larger dynamics at play in his courtroom every day? How many others had he dismissed in the same way? People whose work, voices, and lives deserved more than the automatic judgments that often went unnoticed by those in power. The more Palmer reflected, the more his sense of guilt grew. He thought of the cases he had handled over the years, many of them involving people who didn't have the power or privilege to challenge the system. And yet those very people, like Naomi, had often been the ones most invested in making real change, in reshaping the system that too often failed them. It was a humbling realization, a moment of reckoning. As the days passed, Palmer found himself unable to let go of the need to make things right. He wasn't sure how, or even where to begin, but one thing was clear. He couldn't simply move forward without addressing the truth he had uncovered. This was no longer just about a traffic fine. It was about understanding the people in his courtroom as more than just cases, about seeing them as individuals with stories, histories, and, in Naomi's case, a voice that could change the world. Naomi Evans sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the city outside her window barely breaking the silence. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, but the room was still bathed in the soft glow of her desk lamp, casting a warm, intimate light over her papers and laptop. She had a long night ahead of her, preparing for another round of meetings with federal officials, drafting legal opinions, and reviewing reports that had become second nature to her. This was her world, the world of policy, law, and reform. But it wasn't always like this. Naomi had worked tirelessly to build her career, using every opportunity to advocate for fairness and equality. She knew the systems she fought against all too well. It wasn't just the legal system that needed reform. It was the entire fabric of society that needed to recognize the deep-rooted inequalities and work to untangle them. Her work had brought her into rooms with policymakers, law enforcement leaders, and influential figures who wielded power, but her message had always been the same. True justice required systemic change, and that change had to come from the ground up. Despite her many accomplishments, Naomi's journey hadn't been easy. For years, she had struggled against an invisible wall that many black women in her position faced, being overlooked, underestimated, and sometimes outright ignored. But Naomi was no stranger to adversity. She had learned early on to navigate spaces where she was often the only person of color, the only woman, and at times, the only voice advocating for the very communities that were often left out of the conversation. That evening, as Naomi sat alone with her thoughts, she reflected on the quiet toll of her work. While the changes she fought for were monumental, the personal cost was undeniable. There were moments of exhaustion, of frustration at the slow pace of progress, and of sadness at how deeply entrenched the barriers to true justice were. But what kept her going was the understanding that she had to be the change she wanted to see in the world. It wasn't just about drafting new laws. It was about shifting mindsets, about challenging people to look beyond the surface and question the assumptions they held. The traffic ticket that day was a minor inconvenience, an annoyance she had almost forgotten about, but it did serve as a reminder. Naomi had long accepted that she would always have to operate in a system that wasn't designed for her, a system that would sometimes treat her just like everyone else, without recognizing the full scope of her influence or her work. It was a small, everyday injustice that many people faced, but for Naomi, it symbolized something larger, the way systems often failed to recognize the humanity and depth of the people they governed. As she closed her laptop and began to organize her papers for the next day's meeting, Naomi couldn't help but think about the judge, Thomas Palmer. He had imposed the fine without knowing who she was. In that moment, she was just another person, no different than the countless others who passed through that courtroom every day. But for some reason, his reaction to her had stayed with her. Maybe it was his quick judgment, or the realization that he didn't see her for the work she was doing. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she had a feeling their paths would cross again. And when they did, she would make sure he saw her, not just as a defendant in his court, but as someone who was working to change the system he represented. A few days after the court session, Naomi sat in her office, reviewing a stack of policy reports that needed her attention before the next meeting. The hours had blurred together as she shifted between conference calls, emails, and countless discussions on justice reform. It had become routine, but it never lost its urgency. Every day felt like a step closer to the change she had been fighting for. Her phone buzzed on the desk, its screen lighting up with an unexpected name: Judge Thomas Palmer. Naomi paused, fingers hovering over her keyboard. She hadn't expected to hear from him. After the traffic ticket, something so trivial in the grand scheme of her life, she had assumed it was just a moment that would pass, like countless others she'd experienced in the past. Curious but cautious, Naomi picked up the phone. "Hello," she answered. "Ms. Evans, this is Judge Thomas Palmer. I hope I'm not interrupting you." His voice crackled through the receiver, deep and steady, but carrying an unfamiliar tension. Naomi sat back in her chair, a hint of surprise rising in her chest. "Judge Palmer, to what do I owe this call? I know this might seem out of the blue, but I've been thinking a lot about our interaction in court," he began, the words coming slowly, as though he was choosing each one carefully, "and I wanted to speak with you directly." Naomi raised an eyebrow. She had imagined the judge might reach out to apologize for the fine or explain himself, but she had never anticipated a personal call. "Go on," she said, her voice neutral. "I need to confess something," Judge Palmer continued. "When you were in front of me in court, I didn't recognize who you were, but after you left, I did some research and I was surprised. You're not just anyone, Ms. Evans. You're someone who has been working to change the very system I uphold." He paused, perhaps gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I feel that I didn't fully understand the weight of what you represent, and I'm calling to apologize, to express that I see you now. Not just as another defendant, but as a person who is doing the kind of work that this country needs." Naomi listened, her expression unreadable. She hadn't expected the judge to acknowledge her impact, let alone apologize for the fine. His words were measured, but there was something in his tone that seemed genuine, a mixture of self-reflection and discomfort. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a step, a rare one in her experience. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Palmer," Naomi replied after a pause, her voice soft but firm. "But this conversation isn't just about an apology for a traffic ticket. It's about understanding the systems we work in. Systems that can sometimes overlook the very people trying to change them." The judge was silent for a moment, perhaps processing her words. "I know," he said finally. "I've been thinking about that too. I realize that as a judge, I have a responsibility to do more than just enforce the law. I need to understand the people I'm judging. And I don't think I did that with you." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She had heard many apologies over the years, but rarely from people in positions of power who actually took the time to reflect and change. Still, she wasn't one to let moments of growth slip by. "You've taken the first step by reaching out," Naomi said slowly. "Now it's about what comes next." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but Naomi wasn't one to easily forget the larger picture. If you're serious about understanding the people you serve, it starts with more than just a conversation. It means being proactive about listening, about learning. And I think that's something we could both work on. Judge Palmer was quiet for a moment, then spoke with renewed conviction. "I agree. I'd like to learn more about your work. Perhaps we can meet. I'd like to hear more about the changes you're fighting for. Maybe together, we could begin a conversation on how the judicial system can better serve everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold." Naomi thought for a moment. She wasn't sure what it would lead to, but something about the honesty in his voice made her think that this might not just be an empty gesture. "All right," she said at last. "Let's set up a time. But understand this, change is a long road, and you're not the only one who needs to learn." "Understood," he replied, his voice now lighter, more hopeful. "Thank you, Ms. Evans." As Naomi hung up the phone, she sat quietly for a moment, contemplating the unexpected turn of events. She had no illusions about the difficulties ahead. But maybe, just maybe, this conversation marked the beginning of something important. A week later, Naomi met Judge Thomas Palmer in a small cafe near the courthouse. It wasn't the most glamorous setting, but it was neutral ground, away from the confines of the courtroom. The place had an unassuming charm, clinking coffee cups, soft murmurs of conversation, and the faint scent of pastries in the air. Naomi had arrived early, settling into a quiet corner booth, her laptop open in front of her, but her mind far from the documents she usually immersed herself in. It had been a long time since she'd agreed to a meeting like this. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was curious. Judge Palmer had reached out to apologize, and while she respected the gesture, she didn't know if it was enough. Words alone had never been enough for her, but there was something in his tone, in his willingness to take the first step, that made her think this conversation might be different. Judge Palmer arrived just a few minutes after her, a man in a dark suit who still wore the formal demeanor of the courtroom, but there was a shift in his posture. He wasn't the same man who had presided over her case. He seemed more open, less guarded. Perhaps it was the weight of what he'd learned in the days since their interaction. Perhaps it was the realization that there was more to justice than simply handing down verdicts. "Ms. Evans," he greeted her with a nod, taking a seat across from her. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet." Naomi smiled politely but didn't say anything right away. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee, allowing the quiet moment to settle between them. She wasn't here to make him feel comfortable. She was here to understand his willingness to change. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation," Palmer began, leaning forward. "And I realized that understanding injustice isn't as simple as reading a report or attending a meeting. I've spent years as a judge, but what I never truly grasped was how many of the people who come before me are the very ones trying to make this system better, not just for themselves, but for everyone." Naomi nodded, her gaze steady. "You're right. Many people who are caught in the system are doing their best to navigate it, often with little choice. But it's not just about individuals. It's about recognizing how the system itself is broken, how it can be stacked against certain people from the very start." Judge Palmer absorbed her words in silence. Naomi had always believed that the most important conversations were the ones that forced people to examine their own beliefs and biases, those that dug deeper than surface-level assumptions. "I never understood that fully before," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I've seen cases where people don't get the benefit of the doubt, where their past or their skin color or their socioeconomic status influences how they're treated. And I'd just let it happen." There was a palpable shift in the air as the weight of his acknowledgement hung between them. It wasn't just an apology. It was a recognition of a deeper issue that went far beyond the walls of the courthouse. This wasn't about one traffic ticket. It was about systemic failure, about years of ingrained biases that needed to be addressed, not just by lawmakers, but by those who enforced the laws. Naomi leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. "It's not enough to simply acknowledge the problem, Judge. It's about doing something, taking action, not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard, when it means challenging everything you've known." He met her gaze, eyes open, full of resolve. "I understand that now, and I want to learn how I can be a part of that change. I want to listen. I want to do more than just judge. I want to help reshape the system, even if it's one small step at a time." Naomi studied him for a long moment. There was sincerity in his voice, but she knew words were easy. Action, however, was the true measure. "Let's start with listening," she said quietly. "The real work begins when you start hearing the voices of those who have been ignored for so long." The conversation continued late into the afternoon, a dialogue about justice, reform, and the path forward. As they parted ways, Naomi didn't feel an immediate sense of resolution. She knew there was much more to be done, but there was something different in the air, something that felt like the beginning of a real shift. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it might lead to something meaningful. Months passed, and the relationship between Naomi Evans and Judge Thomas Palmer continued to evolve. What had started as a chance meeting after a simple traffic ticket had transformed into something far more profound. They met regularly, sometimes over coffee, sometimes at her office, and occasionally in quiet corners of legal conferences, discussing the intricacies of justice reform, the limits of the current system, and most importantly, the road ahead. The more they spoke, the more Naomi saw the shift in Palmer. He was no longer just the judge who had fined her for a minor infraction. He had become an ally in the fight for equity, a man who recognized the cracks in the system and was now willing to help repair them. Judge Palmer's transformation didn't happen overnight. The weight of the systems he had spent his career enforcing was not easy to ignore, and the deep-seated biases that shaped the way laws were applied didn't simply disappear. But his commitment to listening and learning became the foundation of his work. He began speaking with community leaders, attending forums about racial injustice, and actively seeking out opportunities to educate himself about the lived experiences of those who had been harmed by the very institutions he had once believed in unconditionally. Naomi watched with cautious optimism as Palmer's actions began to reflect the words he had spoken that day in the cafe. He was no longer the same judge who had handed down fines without understanding the people in his courtroom. He was making real changes, whether it was advocating for diversion programs instead of incarceration, revising sentencing guidelines, or pushing for policies that addressed systemic discrimination in the justice system. Their collaboration had also begun to bear fruit in Naomi's work. Together, they worked on crafting new guidelines for judges, encouraging them to engage more deeply with the communities they served, and to take into account the broader social context when making decisions. Palmer had even suggested that they co-host workshops for other judges, hoping to spread the message of reform and fairness. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting at a national justice reform conference, Naomi found herself sitting alone in a quiet room, staring out at the skyline. The journey had been far from easy, and there were days when it felt like the progress was too slow. But today was different. Today, she was not just a lawyer advocating for change. She was watching the tangible results of her efforts unfold before her eyes. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Judge Palmer standing in the doorway, a slight smile on his face. He carried a folder, which he placed gently on the table in front of her. "I think we're finally ready," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "The proposal is ready for the final vote. If it passes, it could change how courts operate in this district forever." Naomi smiled, her heart lifting. It wasn't just about one case, one courtroom, or one judge. It was about creating a ripple effect that would reach far beyond their individual efforts. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that could inspire others, not just within the courtroom but within the entire legal system. As they sat together, reviewing the proposal, Naomi realized that their partnership was just one example of how change could begin with a single conversation. Sometimes, it took unexpected moments to disrupt the status quo, to turn a small, seemingly insignificant incident into the catalyst for broader transformation. There was still work to be done, of course. The road to true justice was long and winding. But for the first time in a while, Naomi felt a deep sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, change was within reach after all.